The Regulation 2-for-1 rule. I'm Heather Godwin, and this is Scholar's Mate. Hello, and welcome to Scholar's Mate. I'm your host, Heather Godwin. In one of his first official acts as president, Donald Trump signed an executive order designed to curtail federal regulations of American businesses. Here's the president explaining the order.
If you have a regulation you want, number one, we're not going to approve it because it's already been approved probably in 17 different forms. But if we do, the only way you have a chance is we have to knock out 2 regulations for every new regulation. So if there's a new regulation, they have to knock out 2.
But is this 2-for-1 rule a good way to reduce overregulation? Joining us to discuss the issue is Susan Dudley, Director of the George Washington University Regulatory Studies Center and Distinguished Professor of Practice in GWU's Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration. She served as Administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, a staff economist at the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, and a consultant to government and private clients at Economists Incorporated. She is co-author of Regulation, a Primer. And also joining us is Richard Pierce, the Lyle T. Alverson Professor of Law at George Washington University. He has written over 20 books and 130 articles on government regulation and the effects of various forms of government intervention on the performance of markets. His books and articles have been cited in the opinions of numerous agencies and courts, including over a dozen opinions of the U.S. Supreme Court. So, Susan Dudley, could you explain why the 2-for-1 regulation rule is a good idea?
Thanks, Heather. The order you mentioned actually has 2 components. One is, as you mentioned and as we heard the president say, for every new regulation, agencies have to remove 2 regulations. But the other part, and I think this may be more binding, is that they have to offset the costs of new regulations by either modifying or removing existing regulations. So why might that make sense? After all, every president for the last 35 years has required agencies before they issue regulations to make sure that the benefits justify the costs. But despite that requirement, it hasn't constrained the accumulation of regulations. So, and some economists think that those accumulated regulations are hindering economic growth and welfare. The Progressive Policy Institute uses an analogy that I like of pebbles being tossed in the stream. So every individual pebble, like any individual regulation that you toss in the stream, may not have a big impact. But if you keep on tossing them in without ever taking any pebbles out of the stream, you eventually will stop the flow of the river. So I think what this order does that's valuable is it asks agencies to look at the existing stock of regulations, those pebbles that have accumulated, find those that have maybe outlived their usefulness or are not working as intended or cost more than expected, and to remove them. And just another little note, other countries have tried this type of thing, Canada and the United Kingdom, and what they've found is that they can actually do this without reducing public protections, but they can achieve these priorities more cost effectively.
And Richard Pierce, how do you respond to Professor Dudley's argument?
Thanks, Heather. Let me start with her last point first, that the United Kingdom certainly tried this for a while, but a lot of people believe that the tragic high-rise fire that killed so many people in London was caused by the 2-for-1 rule that the United Kingdom had in effect for a couple of years. The coating on the high rises that burned in London is banned in the United States by regulation and is not banned in England because that regulation was rescinded as part of the 2-for-1 program. I think the 2-for-1 order is a very bad idea because, to begin with, it looks only at costs and not at benefits. The average economically significant rule has benefits that are 7.5 times as great as their costs. So I think it's irrational to ignore the benefits of rules and look only at costs. And second, it's highly unlikely to have its desired effect. It's very difficult in the United States to issue any economically significant rule. It's even more difficult to remove one. There's hardly been any removed because trying to get through the notice and comment process and then through the courts is extremely difficult. So I don't think it's going to have its intended effect at all.
And that's actually a very good point, that to rescind a rule or modify a rule, agencies will have to go through all the same steps that they have to go through to develop a new rule. But that brings me to your point about it only considering costs. It is true that the order itself only mentions costs, but OMB's guidelines on the order are very clear that agencies need to still look at the benefits as well as the costs of the rules they're bringing in and the rules that they're removing, and subsequent orders have said the same thing. The President in subsequent orders has confirmed that benefit cost analysis is still still key. The difference is agencies have to do that within a budget constraint. So for the first time they have a budget constraint, which all of us have to live within budget constraints.
That reassures me in the sense that it reinforces my belief that this will not have its intended effect. They're not going to be able to get any rules through that process of removal. And that in turn is going to put them in constant friction with the courts, because about half of the rules that agencies issue are required by statute. And so when an agency tells a court, well, I can't issue this rule because I haven't been able to identify 2 others to eliminate, the court's going to say, do it anyway. And then that's going to put agencies and courts on a collision course throughout this administration.
Susan, I have a question for you, having worked for the EPA. Aren't there regulations that are perhaps so old and outdated that they could start with some of those that are obsolete, or does that really not occur?
There could be some of that, and that's actually what they found in the UK, which started with 1 in, 1 out, and then went to 1 in, 2 out, and are now 1 in, 3 out. So they haven't abandoned the 1 in, this idea. And what they found is that there were a lot of ways to reduce the cost of regulations without changing their benefits. For example, reporting requirements can take a lot of time, and if you can do it, streamline that, that's one way that you can reduce costs. So, and I think that's what we may see from this order. First of all, we may see agencies focusing more attention on looking back, and that's what I think may be one of the most important benefits of it. A colleague of mine jokes that presidents have always told agencies to take out the trash, and they never do. Because every president has said, let's look back at rules too, but there's no incentive to do that. Now there's a motivation. You have to look back because you have to find some that you can either modify or remove before you can put a new regulation in place.
And how do you respond to that?
Well, I think it's unnecessary and unlikely in the United States to detect any large number of economically significant rules that are unduly burdensome and should be removed. We have the requirement of cross-benefit analysis before any rule can be issued. So it would have to be either a mistake or a major change in circumstances that would produce a rule that has costs that are greater than its benefits. It's also totally unnecessary because, as Susan pointed out, for 35 years, every president has ordered every agency to do this. There's also a process, a legal process, through which any regulated firm can file a petition for rulemaking and demand that an agency rescind or amend any rule. Now, I would reinforce that by saying that if the agency chooses not to, but the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs that Susan headed for 2 years concludes that the agency should, then OIRA, that office, should order the agency to begin the process of removing that rule. But we have mechanisms to deal with the problem of unduly burdensome old rules, and they've been in effect for a very, very long time. I doubt that there's a whole lot more out there, certainly not enough to compensate for the costs of any economically significant rules that are, there's what, 80 a year, Susan, something like
Yeah,
that?
even fewer, right.
And you're not going to find 160 old rules to eliminate. So that just means that they're going to stop issuing rules at all, which is going to put them in a constant collision with the courts. The courts are not going to tolerate this. President Trump doesn't yet understand that he lives in a government with 3 branches, not one boss.
I'll agree with you there. I think one minor clarification on how the rule works. Agencies have to, for every new significant rule, so rules that have a significant impact on the economy, and there are a few hundred of those a year, has to be offset with 2 rules, but they can be small rules, and there are thousands and thousands of those, so they don't have to be commensurate. That's why I think the cost aspect is going to be most important. But on the idea that agencies do the benefit cost analysis, keep in mind it is the agencies who are trying to put a rule in place, so who are doing that analysis. So they have incentives to find benefits that exceed costs. And those estimates are very hypothetical and depend on a lot of different assumptions. And they never go back and look to see whether they were right. So those estimates may not, we don't know whether those estimates reflect reality or not, because we haven't looked back to see whether the benefits and the costs that were predicted actually have come to pass.
I think that's an entirely fair point, and it's certainly possible that there's the occasional rule where the estimates are really horribly off, and a retrospective analysis would find that. But I think it's pretty rare, because on average, the benefits are 7.5 times the costs. So you'd have to be very, very far off in the process of estimating the costs and the benefits to make the kind of error that would cause you to issue a rule where the costs actually exceed the benefits.
It sounds to me like there's already that kind of a thought process in place, as you've explained. Is this really, I don't know that the word unnecessary is correct, but is this just really a way for President Trump to rephrase something that really is already in place?
I think what's not in place is the looking back at the rules that have been issued to see what their real benefits and costs are. That just has not happened. And each president has tried to make it happen. President Obama issued several executive orders that said, please do this, and I really mean it that I want you to do it. It still doesn't happen. And I think the reason is that you have to do that analysis before you can issue the rule. But once it's in place, there's nothing that makes it end unless you do more analysis. So what incentive is there to do additional analysis? So I think the incentives are a big part of this, that for the first time agencies have to look back because they can't do something new unless they found something old to modify.
And Richard, what's your opinion?
I do believe that Susan is right, that agencies don't spend as much time and attention on retrospective analysis of existing rules as they should. They're frankly massively underfunded and understaffed. And if you're told by Congress in a statute, backed up by the courts that'll tell you you have to do it, you must issue a rule on this subject. Well, you're going to put your resources into that. And if you're so underfunded and understaffed that absorbs all of your resources, then you simply don't have the staffing and funding necessary to engage in retrospect. So what they should be doing is providing greater funding and staffing for agencies to allow them to perform that function.
Do you have a response to that?
Agency staffing has been growing and growing at a rate faster than GDP within the economy has been growing. So I think perhaps a better solution is to divert some of the resources that are being used to do the benefit cost analysis before a regulation is done to looking at the actual benefits and costs. And I think it would not only help with this rule, but it would inform our next benefit cost analysis for the new rule, because we'd learn about what estimates what we were doing right and what we were doing wrong.
The staffing of the federal government today, the civilian workforce, is at the level it was in the Kennedy administration It has not increased by one person since then. It went up a little bit, and then it went down. Was level in the Clinton administration and went down in the Bush administration, and again was level in the Obama administration. Now, some agencies went up, but the total government civilian workforce is at the level it was during the Kennedy administration.
That's quite the fact.
Can I make an observation on that?
Yeah,
I actually do.
certainly, yeah.
Every year I look at the fiscal budget and look at the staffing of regulatory agencies. So not all the civilian workforce, but the regulatory agency. And it has been increasing. The only dip was during the Reagan administration. There was a decline. Now, the proposed budget, actually, even President Trump's proposed budget shows regulatory agencies increasing, but you may not be surprised when you look at where it's increasing in the immigration agencies,
Department of Homeland Security.
and Homeland Security, and it's decreasing at the Environmental Protection Agency.
Well, he certainly talked a lot about decreasing the Environmental Protection Agency in particular. It sounds like this may actually, though, slow the process of getting regulations through, which already, from what I understand, are cumbersome and slow. Do you think that's going to be an unintended consequence?
I think it's going to be an intended consequence.
I agree with Susan. I think
Purposefully slow the whole train?
I have difficulty attributing a lot of forethought to the president because he hasn't shown that in a lot of areas. But if there was somebody behind this order who actually thought it out, I think what they really said was, of course we're not going to be able to roll back that many regulations. What we want to do is freeze regulations. This is a way of, but that's where they're going to be fighting with the courts every day. That's going to be a problem for them. They're going to have to hire a lot more people at the Department of Justice to defend the agencies who then will be violating statutes on a regular basis by refusing to issue rules. Susan's old agency, EPA, is required to issue new rules governing each criteria pollutant. What is it, every 5 years? That's a whole lot of rules that they're required by law to issue. And if they say, well, we'd like to do it, but we can't because the president, courts are going to throw that excuse away in a second and tell them, do it. That's going to be a problem.
How do you respond?
I do think that they're going to have to think hard about the courts, as agencies always do in issuing a new regulation, because they have to justify the form of the regulation based on the record. But the legislature passes statutes that are very broad and vague and give agencies a lot of discretion. So I think agencies will find ways to achieve the goals more cost effectively, and that would be allowed within the statutes.
Do you think there are certain targeted regulations that this is meant to, as you say, freeze or slow down or get stuck in the mire so that business can continue to function more effectively?
The whipping boy has always been EPA for, 20, 25 years. That's what, at least politicians, I represented a lot of regulated firms, and I didn't get the impression they believed this, but politicians certainly believe that EPA engages in excessively burdensome regulation. EPA accounts for the highest number of economically significant rules that are issued every year. That's been true for a couple of decades, I believe. So if there's a target, I would say it's EPA.
What do you think?
I think this particular order really is an across-the-board order, but if you look at his other orders, I think that's right. Energy, environment, healthcare, a bit of healthcare, financial markets. But I think this particular order is really an across-the-board way to try to reduce the growth of regulations.
Do you think there's a particular agency that this might actually help, that, you know, this is a good idea, and in some respects, as you state, how is this a good idea for some particular agencies?
I think all agencies will benefit from looking hard at their at their regulatory priorities, at what their mission is and what their goals are, and trying to say, how can we do this as cost effectively as possible? That's what we all have to do. Agencies have to do with spending programs, which is the other way that government diverts private resources for public goals. They have to do it within the budget constraint, and so they try to evaluate and find the way to achieve those goals cost effectively. That hasn't happened in the regulatory world because the costs are off budget, and they're just not as accountable. I think it'll make all agencies more accountable, which might make them more efficient.
I think there are already a lot of incentives for agencies to come out with as efficient rules, as cost-effective rules as possible, one of which is the agency that Susan ran for 2 years, which is basically it regulates the regulators. And if they're coming in with something that Susan's agency thinks is unduly burdensome, unduly costly, and you can do it, then Susan's agency will tell them, don't do that. You got to do it this way. And the agencies don't like that, but that's an existing incentive they have to do things the right way to start with.
All right, let's take some questions from our viewers. From Tina Tran. The 2-for-1 rule assumes that the economy is overregulated. Is that the case?
I'll say a lot of economists think so. It's very hard to measure either regulation or its effect on the economy. So there are a lot of different opinions on that.
I don't think that at the federal level the economy is overregulated, and that's largely because of the initiative that President Reagan started and that Susan was part of implementing at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, that makes sure that we don't engage in excessive regulation at the federal level. I actually think there's a lot of excessive regulation at the state and local level. And I'm very happy that the Federal Trade Commission has been moving very aggressively against some of the state agencies that are doing absurdly costly things that are hurting the performance of the economy tremendously.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. The Supreme Court just held last term that a rule that the North Carolina Dental Association issued that said no one but a dentist can whiten your teeth. And the Federal Trade Commission looked at that and said, what? You can go into any drugstore and buy a tooth whitener and do it yourself. No, that's illegal, says the state dental association. The Federal Trade Commission went after them for that, and they won in the Supreme Court. And that's many illustrations of that type are out there. Excessive regulation of occupations. In some states, even a barber cannot sweep the floor in a barber shop. There's a separate state agency that certifies people to sweep the floor in barbershops. That's absurd. That's the level at which we need to focus on excess regulation.
Okay, and next we have Darnell Mullins. What happens when a regulation is eliminated, but the rationale for it remains? Susan?
In those situations that a regulation wouldn't be eliminated, what this order does is it allows regulations to be modified. So if there's a rationale that people still think is a legitimate role for the government to be regulating how private actors behave, agencies would be able to find a way. I mean, if they choose this to be one that to meet the order, they would find a way to modify the regulation.
I think that's not going to happen because the courts will keep it from happening. During the Reagan administration, President Reagan attempted to roll back a lot of rules, and the Supreme Court unanimously rejected those actions. Where the rationale still exists for the rule, the agency can't get away with in court.
Okay, and now it's time for Answer This, where each guest asks a question directly to the other. Who would like to go first?
We tossed a coin earlier, and I will. Professor Pierce, how would you deal with the problem of accumulation of regulations, or using my earlier analogy, all the pebbles that have been tossed in the stream?
I suppose it's plausible that there could be situations like that. I have seen absolutely no support for the belief that that's the case. I think in most circumstances, if you've got Rule 1 with $75 million in benefits and $10 million in costs, and Rule 2 with $75 million in benefits and $10 million in costs, you add them together and you get two rules with $150 million in benefits and $20 million in costs. There may be some unusual circumstance in which the two rules are operating at cross purposes, but if so, I think it's quite rare.
Okay, Richard, and what question do you have for Susan?
Susan, the agency that you ran for 2 years, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, has estimated that the average economically significant rule has benefits that are about 7.5 times as great as the costs. Do you disagree with that?
He wants me to disagree with my agency. I think it's important to keep in mind that those estimates, OIRA's estimates, it's not an independent estimate that OIRA does, that my agency, my former agency does, but it's actually they tally up the estimates from the individual agencies. So that estimate has all the problems that I identified. It's the agency itself that is analyzing its benefits and costs, all the assumptions and things that go in there. And if you read the reports, OMB's reports, they list a lot of the caveats and assumptions, and so they really do kind of stand back a little bit. I think maybe the more important thing, those are the agency's estimates before the regulation went into effect. So it was before we know anything about how the regulation really works in the real world. So I think I would actually say no. I actually have an article on that's called Perpetuating Puffery, and it explains why those estimates shouldn't be taken as gospel.
All right, and now it's time for We Agree, where each guest names something the other said he or she agrees with. Who would like to start? Richard, you want to go first, since Susan went first before?
So I agree that the agency that Susan headed for 2 years, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, is a very important agency that performs very important functions of making sure that we don't engage in excess regulation at the federal level.
Yes, and I do agree with that. I think we agree on a lot. But another thing I think we agree on is that benefit cost analysis is an essential component of rulemaking, both for regulations that are being introduced, but also for regulations that are being modified or rescinded.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's all we have time for. We'd like to thank Susan Dudley of the George Washington University Regulatory Studies Center and Richard Pierce of the GWU School of Law for joining us to discuss this issue. And thank you for watching Scholars Mate. I'm Heather Godwin. We'll see you next time.